So this is our second virtual year of doing best books. I was hoping this year we would be able to do it in person, but that's not quite the case. So next year, hopefully we'll be back to in-person best books. Each year we solicit recommendations from patrons, volunteers, and staff for the best books they've read during the previous year. The last 2 years, we've had an online survey that Erin has put on the website that has really increased patron participation, so that's been really nice. We look at critics lists, end of the year, best books lists, and award winners. I then try to come up with a list covering a wide variety of books in all genres, ranging from literary fiction to science fiction to romance to biography to science to you name it. Not every book that is recommended is discussed. I do limit these books to those published in 2021 or the very end of 2020. And while the discussed books are in the handout list, which is going to be online and is also available here at the library in a hard copy, everything that everybody's suggested and recommended, as well as all the other critic stuff, is on the little booklet list. So this is what I'm talking about today, but this has that plus everything else. Okay, I can only discuss so many books, so I have to make some hard choices. I discuss only books available in print at our library for discussion, but the book list indicates availability in different formats. So when you get the book list, you can see over here, it talks about whether or not, it's got little abbreviations, for whether or not it's available in audiobook on CD, ebook, e-audio, or large print. So there's other formats for a bunch of these that are available. I try to give a brief description of the book, maybe quote a patron or a coworker who had something to say about the book. I may quote one of the review journals like Booklist, Library Journal, Kirkus, Publishers Weekly. And occasionally I'll mention read-alikes, like if you like this book, you might like something else. And sometimes, a couple of times, I have a couple of fun facts about books. So I don't have too many of those because I don't have a whole lot of time, but there's a few fun things. And finally, I have not read all of these books, so it's sometimes hard to talk about them. This time I've read about a third of them, which I think is a record for me. So if the book at all sounds interesting, I highly recommend you at least try reading it, because so many times after I've done this program, I then read the book and think, oh my God, if I just read it first, I could have done such a better description. Since I have about 1 minute description, there's not a lot of stuff I can get in. If anything sounds interesting, do try it. Don't just take my description. Some of my descriptions actually of the books are really short and some are a little longer. Some of the books are really hard to describe. And so, sometimes I get a little wordy. Okay, I think with that, I am ready to start. So hopefully this will all go well. And I'm going to try and share my screen now. Let's see. The other thing I might mention too, as I'm sharing my screen, is I am recording this in the back of the library. And so while I have a sign that says, please be quiet, recording program, if there is noise going on, I apologize. Everybody pretty much knows about it, and hopefully it'll be fine. Okay. I'm hoping, Erin, is that looking okay?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay, very good. Okay. So we got a lot of books to cover, so I'm gonna try and move fairly quickly, and we'll see how this works. So we start with fiction, and the very first book on this list is really hard to describe. So this is by the author of Normal People, which was a best book a couple years ago. Alice, a novelist, meets Felix, who works in a warehouse, and asks him if he'd like to travel to Rome with her. In Dublin, her best friend Eileen is getting over a breakup and slips back into flirting with Simon, a man she has known since childhood. Alice, Felix, Eileen, and Simon are still young, but life is catching up with them. They desire each other, they delude each other, they get together, they break apart. This book was on just about every critic's list of best books for 2021. Booklist gave it a starred review, saying, writing with their trademark truthfulness and wit, Rooney compels with both these meta conversations and the actions of her characters' lives, their enthralling, intimate, and consequential grappling with themselves, with one another, and with beauty, sex, and friendship. Rooney's first novel since Normal People, which became a very popular and award-winning Hulu series, is steadily drawing excitement. Okay, Beautiful World. I'm sorry, Bewilderment by Richard Powers. Astrobiologist Theo Byrne searches for life throughout the cosmos while single-handedly raising his 9-year-old son, Robin, following the death of his wife. Robin is warm, kind, and smart, but he's also about to be expelled from 3rd grade for smashing his friend in the face. As his son grows more troubled, Theo hopes to keep him off psychoactive drugs. He learns of an experimental neurofeedback treatment to bolster Robin's emotional control, one that involves training the boy on the recorded patterns of his mother's brain. Kirkus calls this a touching novel that offers a vital message with uncommon sympathy and intelligence. You may know Powers as the author of Overstory, which was a really popular book just maybe 2 years ago. It was another best book. Black Ice by Karen Gerhardson. So this is our Scandinavian thriller of the year. January in Gotland, Sweden. The days are short, the air is cold, and all the roads are covered in snow. On a deserted, icy back road, these wintry conditions will soon bring together a group of strangers with a force devastating enough to change their lives forever, when, in the midst of a brief period, a deadly accident and 2 separate crimes leaves the victims in their wake. Chilling and atmospheric, Black Ice is a gripping standalone novel of suspense. It is not a police or a detective story, but a brooding novel involving 3 main female characters with surprises right up to the end. Many of you may have read All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. That was a huge hit a few years ago. And this was one of the most highly reviewed novels of the year and requested by a lot of people here. It's different from his other novels. The heroes of Cloud Cuckoo Land are trying to figure out the world around them. Anne and Omir, on opposite sides of the formidable city walls during the 1453 siege of Constantinople, teenage idealist Seymour in an attack on a public library in present-day Idaho, and Constance on an interstellar ship bound for an exoplanet decades from now. Kirkus gave us a starred review and wrote, Doerr builds a community of readers and nature lovers that transcends the boundaries of time and space. This is just one of the many narrative miracles worked by the author as he brings a first-century story to its conclusion in 2146. As the pieces of this magical literary puzzle snap together, a flicker of hope is sparked for our benighted world. Court of Silver Flames. This is number 4 in a young adult fantasy series. Nesta Archerin has always been prickly proud, swift to anger, and slow to forgive. And ever since being forced into the cauldron and becoming high fae against her will, she's struggled to find a place for herself within the strange, deadly world she inhabits. Worse, she can't seem to move past the horrors of the war with Hybern and all she lost in it. Even though it's YA, adult fantasy readers, I think, will enjoy the Court of Thorns and Roses series. Some adult read-alikes, which you may have seen, are books by J.R. Ward and Sherilyn Kenyon. A Distant Grave is number 2 in a series, the Maggie Darcy series. Long Island homicide detective Maggie Darcy and her teenage daughter Lily are still recovering from the events of last fall when a strange new case demands Maggie's attention. The body of an unidentified Irish national turns up in a wealthy Long Island beach community, and with little to go on but the scars on his back, Maggie once again teams up with Garda detectives in Ireland to find out who the man was and what he was doing on Long Island. As the strands of the mystery lead Maggie to a quiet village in rural County Clare and back to her home turf, they also lead her in a range of a dangerous and determined killer who will do anything to keep the victim's story hidden forever. If you've read books by Tana French or Dervla McTiernan, then you might enjoy the Maggie Darcy series by Sarah Stewart Taylor. Desolation called Peace. This is a hard science fiction novel. It's the sequel to a memory called Empire. I'm not going to try to pronounce the name of the series. So an alien armada lurks on the edges of the Empire's space. No one can communicate with it. No one can destroy it. And the fleet captain is running out of options. In a desperate attempt at diplomacy, he sends for a diplomatic envoy who face the impossible task of trying to communicate with a hostile entity. Failure will guarantee millions of deaths. Success might prevent the Empire's destruction and allow it to continue its rapacious expansion. Library Journal says, this follow-up to Martine's debut novel contains beautiful prose and complex world building that will immerse readers in a dazzling story of alien contact and colonization. Dream Girl is by Laura Lippman. We have others of her books here at the library, including Lady in the Lake and Sunburn, and she's just written a book of short stories called Seasonal Work. After being injured in a freak accident, novelist Jerry Anderson lies in a hospital bed in his glamorous but sterile apartment, isolated from the busy world he can see through his windows. Utterly dependent on two women he barely knows, his young assistant and a night nurse whose competency he questions. But Jerry is also beginning to question his own competency as he moves in and out of dreamlike memories and seemingly random appearances of a persistent ex-girlfriend at his bedside. He fears he may be losing his grip on reality, much like his mother who recently passed away from dementia. Most distressing, he believes he's being plagued by strange telephone calls in which a woman claiming to be the titular character of his hit novel, Dream Girl, swears she'll be coming to see him soon. The character is completely fictitious, but no one has ever believed Jerry when he makes that claim. Is he the victim of a cruel prank, or is he actually losing his mind? Finlay Donovan is killing it. This is the first in a new series. Finlay Donovan is killing it, except she's really not. A stressed out single mom of two and struggling novelist, Finlay's life is in chaos. The new book she's promised her literary agent isn't written. Her ex-husband fired the nanny without telling her, and this morning she had to send her 4-year-old to school with hair duct taped to her head after an incident with scissors. When Finlay is overheard discussing the plot of her new suspense novel with her agent over lunch, she's mistaken for a contract killer and inadvertently accepts an offer to dispose of a problem husband in order to make ends meet. She soon discovers that crime in real life is a lot more difficult than its fictional counterpart as she becomes entangled in a real-life murder investigation. The Four Winds is by Kristen Hanna, and many of you have probably read some of her other books, including The Nightingale, The Great Alone, and others. We have quite a few of hers here at the library. This book takes place in Texas, 1934. Millions are out of work, and a drought has broken the Great Plains. The Dust Bowl has arrived with a vengeance. Elsa Martinelli, like so many of her neighbors, must make an agonizing choice: fight for the land she loves or go west to California in search of a better life. Publishers Weekly Starred Review calls it a riveting story of love, courage, and sacrifice. Hannah combines gritty realism with emotionally rich characters and lyrical prose that rings brightly and true. In Elsa, a woman who fiercely defends her principles and those she loves, Kristen Hanna brilliantly revives the ghost of Tom Joad. I was standing in the library recently and I actually heard somebody talking about how wonderful Kristen Hanna's books are. And I thought, well, I hope she's reading this one, her latest. Okay. Oops. Okay, here we go. Go Tell the Bees That I Am Gone. This is number 9 in the Outlander series. One of my coworkers wrote, we've been waiting years for this 9th volume in the Outlander series, so it would be impossible to live up to all the expectations, but Gabaldon comes close. We pick right back up with Jamie, Claire, and their ever-expanding clan in North Carolina and beyond. It's now mid-Revolutionary War, and the Frasers are doing their best to stay out of the action, but conflict is coming for them anyway. We also get to visit many of the other characters who've appeared in previous books. There are incidents of shocking and brutal violence, but also hilarious light moments. Like her earlier books, this one also ends with many unfinished plot threads, and I really hope she's writing fast for the promised 10th and possible final book. Who knows? Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead, an unforgettable story of a daredevil female aviator determined to chart her own course in life at any cost. Great Circle spans Prohibition-era Montana, the Pacific Northwest, Alaska, New Zealand, wartime London, and modern-day Los Angeles. Kirkus in their starred review notes, the destinies of Shipstead's unforgettable characters intersect in ways that reverberate through 100 years of story. Whether she's creating scenes in the Prohibition-era American West, in wartime London, or on a Hollywood movie set, her research is as invisible as it should be, allowing a fully immersive experience. Ingeniously structured and so damned entertaining, this novel is as ambitious as its heroines, but it never falls from the sky. From the best-selling author of Lily and the Octopus and the Editor comes a warm and deeply funny novel about a once famous gay sitcom star whose unexpected family tragedy leaves him with his niece and nephew for the summer. A staff member who read this book reports, "This is a lovely novel, at times heartbreaking, arch, and hilarious. Patrick is a complicated and singular person who's been hiding out from the tragedy in his own past, and taking care of the kids feels like his chance at redemption and maybe new life for all of them. There's a wonderful cast of characters surrounding him, from intrepid junior agents to the charming throuple next door." This was a National Book Award winner, as you see by the little emblem there. In Jason Mott's Hell of a Book, a Black author sets out on a cross-country publicity tour to promote his best-selling novel. That storyline drives Hell of a Book and is the scaffolding of something much larger and urgent, since Mott's novel also tells the story of Soot, a young Black boy living in a rural town in the recent past, and the Kid, a possibly imaginary child who appears to the author on his tour. As these character stories build and converge, they astonish. For while this heartbreaking and magical book entertains and is at once about family, love of parents and children, art, and money, it's also about the nation's reckoning with a tragic police shooting playing over and over again on the news, and with what it can mean to be Black in America. CBS Saturday Morning calls Mott a singular writer who refused to be boxed in, and proves it again with, yes, a hell of a book. In by Will McPhail is a graphic novel. Staff member wrote, "The art in this graphic novel is gorgeous. Most of the story is told in simple black and white sketches," and there's an example on the screen. "But when Nick goes in to really see a person, the panels become rich and fantastical paintings and dramatic color. Overall, it's not a happy story, but there were touches of wry humor. I particularly love the sight gags of the on-the-nose coffee shop names." So Ishiguro, you may know as the author of The Remains of the Day, which has become an English classic, Never Let Me Go, and other books. So this past year, he published Clara and the Sun. It tells the story of Clara, an artificial friend with outstanding observational qualities, who from her place in the store watches carefully the behavior of those who come in to browse and of those who pass on the street outside. She remains hopeful that a customer will soon choose her. NPR reported, "One of the joys of Ishiguro's novels is the way they recall and reframe each other, almost like the same stories told in different formats. Again and again, he asks, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to have a self? And how much of that self can and should we give to others?" The Last Chance Library is by Freya Sampson. Lonely librarian June has never left the sleepy English village where she grew up. Shy and reclusive, the 30-year-old would rather spend her time buried in books than venture out into the world. But when her library is threatened with closure due to budget cuts, June is forced to emerge from behind the shelves to save the heart of her community and the place that holds the dearest memories of her mother. Library Journal says, fans of libraries and heartfelt, humorous women's fiction with a powerful message and a hint of romance won't want to miss this one. It's so good that readers may very well devour it in one sitting. A read-alike book of this is The Reading List, which is I'm going to mention and talk about here in just a few minutes. The Last Thing He Told Me by Laura Dave. We all have stories we never tell. Before Owen Michaels disappears, he manages to smuggle a note to his beloved wife of 1 year. Protect her. Despite her confusion and fear, Hannah Hall knows exactly to whom the note refers. Owen's 16-year-old daughter, Bailey. Bailey, who lost her mother tragically as a child. Bailey, who wants absolutely nothing to do with her new stepmother. As Hannah's increasingly desperate calls to Owen go unanswered, as the FBI arrests Owen's boss, as a U.S. Marshal and FBI agents arrive at her Sausalito home unannounced, Hannah quickly realizes her husband isn't who he said he was, and that Bailey just may hold the key to figuring out Owen's true identity and why he really disappeared. The Left-Handed Twin is number 9 in the Jane Whitfield series by Thomas Perry. And I believe we've had some Thomas Perry books as best books in the past. I'm not sure. Jane Whitfield helps people disappear. Fearing for their lives, fleeing dangerous situations, her clients come to her when they need to vanish completely, to assume a new identity and establish a new life somewhere they won't be found. And when people are desperate enough to need her services, they come to the old house in rural Western New York where Jane was raised to begin their escape. It's there that one spring night, Jane finds a young woman fresh from LA with a whole lot of trouble behind her. After she cheated on her boyfriend, he dragged her to the home of the offending man and made her watch as he killed him. She testified against the boyfriend, but a bribed jury acquitted him, and now he's free and trying to find and kill her. So a lot of you may be familiar with Amor Towles. Amor, I'm not sure how he pronounces his name. He wrote A Gentleman in Moscow a few years ago and Rules of Civility. Both of those were highly well-received novels. And this was one of the most popular, I would say, literary novels that was requested here at the library this year. In 1954, 18-year-old Emmett Watson is driven home to Nebraska by the warden of the juvenile work farm where he has just served 15 months for involuntary manslaughter. His mother long gone, his father recently deceased, and the family farm foreclosed upon by the bank. Emmett's intention is to pick up his 8-year-old brother Billy and head to California. But when the warden drives away, Emmett discovers 2 friends from the work farm have hidden themselves in the trunk of the warden's car. Together, they have hatched an altogether different plan for Emmett's future, one that will take them all on a fateful journey in the opposite direction to New York City. Spanning just 10 days and told from multiple points of view, Towles' third novel will satisfy fans of his multi-layered styling. So now here's kind of a fun, interesting fact about, kind of off topic, but about the author here. So when Towles was 10 years old and on his summer vacation on Long Island, he put a note in a bottle which read, "If this makes it to China, please write back," and he threw it in the ocean. Well, he got an answer back which said, "I'm afraid your bottle did not make it to China." And it was written by Harrison Salisbury, who was then the assistant editor of the New York Times. And he was already a noted historian and author about the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union. And we have a couple of his books here. So when Towles was about 18, he went to New York and visited and met Salisbury. And much later, when he was writing A Gentleman in Moscow, he remembered Salisbury, and Salisbury, who had been a correspondent in Moscow, and stayed at the Metropole Hotel where A Gentleman in Moscow takes place. And so he was able to use Harrison Salisbury's reminiscences and information to write A Gentleman in Moscow. So there's a little bit of extra about Towles. There's his picture. Okay. The Love Songs of W.E. Du Bois by Honoré Fanon Jeffers. The 2020 National Book Award nominated poet makes her fiction debut with this epic, an intimate yet sweeping novel that chronicles the journey of one American family from the centuries of the colonial slave trade through the Civil War to our own tumultuous era. It has starred reviews by Publishers Weekly, Kirkus Book List, Library Journal, you name it. A reviewer with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution writes, Jeffers has created an opus, an indelible entry to the canon of contemporary American literature and one of the foundational fictional texts of Black literature worthy of sitting alongside Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, and Jessamine Ward's Sing, Unburied Sing. Malibu Rising is by Taylor Jenkins Reid. 4 famous siblings throw an epic party to celebrate the end of summer. Nina, surfer and supermodel. Jay, championship surfer. Hud, famous photographer. And baby sister Ket. But over the course of 24 hours, their lives will be changed forever. Each has their own secrets. Malibu Rising is the story of one unforgettable night in the life of a family. The night they each have to choose what they will keep from the people who made them and what they will leave behind. Kirkus calls this a compulsively readable story about the bonds between family members and the power of breaking free. So some of you may have read The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osmond. This is the next in the series. This is a wonderful series. And if you have not read The Thursday Monday Club, you really should. Elizabeth, Joyce, Ron, and Ibrahim, The Thursday Murder Club, are still riding high off their recent real-life murder case and are looking forward to a bit of peace and quiet at Cooper's Chase, their posh retirement village. But they are out of luck. An unexpected visitor, an old pal of Elizabeth's, or perhaps more than just a pal, arrives desperate for her help. He has been accused of stealing diamonds worth millions from the wrong men, and he's seriously on the lam. Then, as night follows day, the first body is found, but not the last. Cast out of the royal court by Eleanor of Aquitaine, deemed too coarse and rough-hewn for marriage or courtly life, 17-year-old Marie de France is sent to England to be the new prioress of an impoverished abbey, its nuns on the brink of starvation and beset by disease. A great historical fiction about an unusual woman in the Middle Ages. If you enjoy other historical fiction about women, such as The Book of Longings by Sue Monk Kidd or Illuminations by Mary Sherratt, you might enjoy Matrix. This was a really good book. It follows this one character's whole life, and she is connected in some way, though it's never become clear, to Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and it's just a really good historical fiction. So here's a book that a number of us have read and have really particularly enjoyed. The Narrowboat Summer by Anne Youngson. Meet Eve, who has left her 30-year career to become a free spirit. Sally, who has waved goodbye to her indifferent husband and 2 grown-up children. And Anastasia, a defiantly independent narrowboat dweller who is suddenly landlocked and vulnerable. And if you don't know what narrowboats are, there are these really long, narrow canal boats in England. The canals in England used to be used for commerce, and now it's pretty much people either live there on their boats or they're used by tourists. Before they quite know what they've done, Sally and Eve agree to drive Anastasia's narrowboat on a journey through the canals of England as she awaits a life-saving operation. As they glide gently, and not so gently, through the countryside of England, the eccentricities and challenges of narrowboat life draw them inexorably together, and a tender and unforgettable story unfolds. At summer's end, all 3 women must decide whether to return to the lives they left behind or forge a new path forward. One of my coworkers said, this was an enchanting book, part travelogue, part portrait of an unusual friendship. It definitely made me want to take a canal boat trip, and I heartily agree. It was a wonderful book. So Ken Follett writes a wide variety of novels, from building cathedrals in the Middle Ages to World War II and Egypt. Never is kind of a book of tomorrow about a possible war. A shrinking oasis in the Sahara Desert, a stolen US Army drone, an uninhabited Japanese island, and one country's secret stash of deadly chemical poisons. All these play roles in a relentlessly escalating crisis. Struggling to prevent the outbreak of world war are a young woman intelligence officer, a spy working undercover with jihadists, a brilliant Chinese spy master, and Pauline Green, President of the United States. This book is as fast-paced and gripping as a Jack Reacher novel. Booklist calls it absolutely compelling, a smart, scary, and all too plausible thriller. And considering threats currently made by Russia now having to do with Ukraine and the world, it's a very scary book to read. So if you don't want to read about bad endings, you might want to stay away from Never. Okay, this is New Girl in Little Cove, and it's by Doudna Monahan. And I had to look up how to pronounce her first name because that's not a name I'm familiar with. Doudna. A charming fish out of water story in the tradition of Anne of Green Gables are all creatures great and small. In 1980s Canada, well-meaning but naive French teacher Rachel accepts a job in the tiny Newfoundland hamlet of Little Cove. She meets a cast of eccentric but ultimately good-hearted townspeople. Her high school students are wild, but she's determined to get through to them. Cut off from big city nightlife and amenities, Rachel learns to depend on her new community. This reads like a memoir in a good way. Even though Monahan says in her author's note that most of the events are fictional, it's obvious that she was inspired by her love for Newfoundland and her own experiences teaching there. The first-person narrative brings the reader right into the story. This would be excellent for readers who enjoy cozy small-town novels. There's a romance, but this is very much a coming-of-age story for a new teacher. And a fun fact for those of you who do not know Newfoundland history, Newfoundland was actually not a part of Canada until 1949. Up until then, it was directly ruled by England, so it was not a province of Canada. So, okay. Northern Spy by Flynn. The acclaimed author of Under the Harrow, a Yorkshire-based thriller, returns with her most thrilling novel to date, the story of two sisters who become entangled with the IRA. Riveting, atmospheric, and exquisitely written, Northern Spy is at once a heart-pounding story of the contemporary IRA and a moving portrait of sister and motherhood and of life in a deeply divided society. New York Times Book Review calls it a chilling, gorgeously written tale. Barry keeps the tension almost unbearably high. Oh, William is by Elizabeth Strout. And she, of course, is the author of the acclaimed Olive Kitteridge, The Burgess Boys, and My Name is Lucy Barton. In this book, she actually continues some of the story of Lucy Barton. Lucy Barton is a writer, but her ex-husband, William, remains a hard man to read. William, she confesses, has always been a mystery to me. Another mystery is why the two have remained connected after all these years. They just are. So Lucy is both surprised and not surprised when William asks her to join him on a trip to investigate a recently uncovered family secret. One of those secrets that rearrange everything we think we know about the people closest to us. What happens next is nothing less than another example of what Hilary Mantel has called Elizabeth Strout's perfect attunement to the human condition. Poppy and Alex. Alex and Poppy, they have nothing in common. She's a wild child. He wears khakis. She is insatiable wanderlust. He prefers to stay home with a book. And somehow, ever since a fateful car share home from college many years ago, they are the very best of friends. For most of the year, they live far apart. She's in New York City and he's in their small hometown. But every summer for a decade, they have taken one glorious week of vacation together. Until 2 years ago, when they ruined everything. They haven't spoken since. Now Poppy is stuck in a rut. She decides to convince her best friend to take one more vacation together, lay everything on the table, make it all right. Miraculously, he agrees. Now she has a week to fix everything. If only she can get around the one big truth that has always stood quietly in the middle of their seemingly perfect relationship. What could possibly go wrong? Read-alikes include The Flatshare by Beth O'Leary, which was a best book a couple of years ago, and Paris is Always a Good Idea by Jen McKinley. You might have heard this book mentioned. This was a really good historical fiction, but it's the story of a real woman's life. In her 20s, Belle DaCosta Green is hired by J.P. Morgan to curate a collection of rare manuscripts, books, and artwork for his newly built Pierpont Morgan Library. Belle becomes a fixture on the New York society scene and one of the most powerful women in the art and book world, known for her impeccable taste and shrewd negotiating as she helps build a world-class collection. But Belle has a secret. She is African-American, passing as white, explaining that her complexion isn't dark because of her alleged Portuguese heritage. Based on a real person, this is fantastic historical fiction. So several years ago, Andy Weir wrote the book The Martian, which got turned into a movie, very popular movie. This year he comes out with Project Hail Mary. Ryland Grace is the sole survivor on a desperate last chance mission, and if he fails, humanity and the Earth itself will perish. Except right now he doesn't know that. He can't even remember his own name, let alone the nature of his assignment or how to complete it. A hard science fiction novel with alien contact part of the equation, the book is tense and fast-paced. Because the character is a high school science teacher, the many scientific explanations are easy for the layperson to understand. This was really a delightful little book, A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers, and it is the first in a series. It's been centuries since the robots of Panga gained self-awareness and laid down their tools. Centuries since they wandered en masse into the wilderness, never to be seen again. Centuries since they faded into myth and urban legend. Dex is a tea monk, traveling with her cart to separated communities, lending a patient ear and offering wisdom and advice over specifically selected cups of tea. You see on the cover of the book here, her little wagon, and she goes to these communities and they all expect her, and you go up and you tell her your problem, and then she selects the most appropriate tea. One day, the life of this tea monk is upended by the arrival of a robot, there to honor the old promise of checking in. The robot cannot go back until the question of what do people need is answered. But the answer to that question depends on who you ask and how. They're going to need to ask it a lot. Becky Chambers' new series asks, in a world where people have what they want, does having more matter? This is fantasy, science fiction, literary fiction. It's a delightful small book, the first in the Monk and Robot series. In this thriller, though Blythe Connor is determined to be a loving mother, she's convinced that there's something wrong with daughter Violet, a fear that her husband firmly rejects, leading Blythe to wonder whether she's losing her mind. Blythe gets a respite when their son Sam is born, but a single terrible event reconfirms her fears. The Washington Post writes, "What happens when a mother doesn't love her daughter?" Audrain's debut is a tense, chilling dip into the dark side of motherhood, narrated by Blythe, whose own upbringing raises the question, can one inherit an inability to parent? The push is uncomfortable and provocative, like a train wreck that demands your gaze. Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. We have a couple of his books here at the library now. A married couple, Isaiah, Black, and Derek, White, are murdered. Their fathers are devastated by the loss and band together in a desperate desire for revenge. In their quest to do better for their sons in death than they did in life, hardened men like Ike and Buddy Lee will confront their own prejudices about their sons and each other as they rain down vengeance on those who hurt their boys. Provocative and fast-paced, Razorblade Tears is a story of bloody retribution, heartfelt change, and maybe even redemption. Cosby is an Anthony Award-winning writer from Southeastern Virginia and is also the best-selling author of Blacktop Wasteland. So here is the reading list. This is a read-alike having to do with similar to that library book I mentioned earlier. This was a really interesting, fun book to read. An aging widower and a lonely teenage girl form an unlikely friendship by bonding over books. Alicia works at the Harrow Road Library in North London, not for her love of books, but because she needs the money. When Mukesh, an older man who's recently lost his wife, visits the library seeking a book recommendation, Alicia has little to offer. As he pushes for a suggestion, she becomes defensive, even rude. She regrets her behavior almost immediately, but she's more focused on difficulties in her home life, including her absentee father and her mentally fragile mother. Even so, when she stumbles on a handwritten reading list tucked into a just-returned book, she impulsively uses it as a way to apologize to Mukesh, recommending the first book, To Kill a Mockingbird. She also decides to read every book on the list herself, rationalizing that it will help pass the long days in the library. Obviously, she has a library she can read in. When Mukesh returns to tell Alicia how much he enjoyed To Kill a Mockingbird, they decide to create an impromptu book club. It seems this budding relationship is just the thing to save Mukesh from his continued grief over his late wife. Meanwhile, Alicia begins relying on Mukesh as the only stable adult in her life. When her family suffers a devastating event, she looks to him to help pick up the pieces, but he's not sure he's the person she needs. This was a great book, kind of interesting. It goes a little bit back in time, just a couple of years, as different people in this community come across this book list. And the book list means different things to them. And it's great how it all comes together at the end. So read-alikes, again, the previously mentioned The Last Chance Library. This would make a great book club selection. Single mom Rosaline can't believe she qualified for Bake Expectations, Britain's favorite baking show, which is 100% not based on Great British Bake Off, no matter how similar the format, the ribald hosts, and the famous judges. She's feeling a little stuck in her life and looking for a new challenge. And now here she is, mixing with a variety of people, grannies, teens, successful professionals. There are even some distractingly handsome men, including landscape architect Elaine and burly electrician Harry. Rosaline isn't on the show to find love, but maybe it'll find her. A coworker wrote, "The baking show is a great setting for Rosaline to come into her own. I loved all the characters, even the villains. Her daughter and friends at home are hilariously sweet, and the romance, I won't give anything away, made me very happy for her. I can't wait to see what else is coming in the series. Also, the discussion questions and recipes at the end of the book are hysterical." Louise Erdrich, of course, is the author of a lot of literary fiction. She's been around for quite a while. A small independent bookstore in Minneapolis is haunted from November 2019 to November 2020 by the store's most annoying customer. Flora dies on All Souls Day, but she simply won't leave the store. Tookie, who has landed a job selling books after years of incarceration that she survived by reading with murderous attention, must solve the mystery of this haunting while at the same time trying to understand all that occurs in Minneapolis during a year of grief, astonishment, isolation, and furious reckoning. Silverview was published posthumously by John Le Carre, and it was actually completed by his son Nick. It's not as huge a book as a lot of Le Carre's books are, which is probably why I was able to read it. This has been really well reviewed this year, even though it's a little bit out of the length and depth and complexity of his previous novels. Julian Lonsley has renounced his high-flying job in the city for a simpler life running a bookshop in a small English seaside town. But only a couple of months into his new career, Julian's evening is disrupted by a visitor. Edward, a Polish emigre living in Silverview, the big house on the edge of town, seems to know a lot about Julian's family and is rather too interested in the inner workings of his modest new enterprise. When a letter turns up at the door of a spy chief in London warning him of a dangerous leak, the investigations lead him to this quiet town by the sea. Okay, our last fiction book is Who is Maud Dixon by Alexandra Andrews. Florence Darrow is a low-level publishing employee who believes that she's destined to be a famous writer. When she stumbles into a job as the assistant to the brilliant, enigmatic novelist known as Maud Dixon, whose true identity is secret, it appears that the universe is finally providing Florence's big chance. Who is Maud Dixon? Is clever, cunning, and diabolical in the best possible way. Anyone looking for a good old-fashioned thrill need look no further. So says Ann Patchett, author of The Dutch House. Okay, so now we're going to head into nonfiction. Some of the descriptions here are a little shorter, just because by the nature of nonfiction, a lot of times you kind of know what the book's about by the cover of the title. Democracy was broken, or that was what many Americans believed in the decades after the Civil War. Shaken by economic and technological disruption, they sought safety in aggressive tribal partisanship. The results were the loudest, closest, most violent elections in U.S. history, driven by vibrant campaigns that drew our highest ever voter turnouts. Kind of sounds like today, except this is the 19th century America. The story is told through the lives of a remarkable father-daughter dynasty. The radical Congressman William Pig Iron Kelly and his fiery progressive daughter Florence Kelly led lives packed with drama, intimately tied to the nation's politics. Through their friendships and feuds, campaigns, and crusades, Will and Florence trace the narrative of a democracy in crisis. This was the National Book Award winner, All That She Carried by Taya Miles. A renowned historian traces the life of a single object handed down through 3 generations of Black women to craft an extraordinary testament to people who are left out of the archives. In the 1850s South Carolina, an enslaved woman named Rose faced a crisis, the imminent sale of her daughter Ashley. Thinking quickly, she packed a cotton bag with a few precious items as a token of love and to try to ensure Ashley's survival. Soon after, the 9-year-old girl was separated from her mother and sold. Decades later, Ashley's granddaughter, Ruth, embroidered this family history on the bag in spare yet haunting language. Now, in this moving new book inspired by the gift, historian Taya Miles carefully unearths these women's faint presence in archival records to follow the paths of their lives. All the Young Men by Ruth Coker Burks and Kevin Carr O'Leary. It's a gripping and triumphant tale of human compassion, the true story of Ruth Coker Burks, a young single mother in Hot Springs, Arkansas, who finds herself driven to the forefront of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and becomes a pivotal activist in America's fight against AIDS. During the AIDS epidemic in the late 1980s, she used her salary as a real estate agent to care for AIDS patients whose families and communities had abandoned them. Due to the stigma surrounding the disease at that time, she was often the patient's only caregiver until they eventually died. She is additionally recognized for burying a number of AIDS victims in Hot Springs, Arkansas. She was actually referred to as a cemetery angel. The Anthropocene is the current geological age in which human activity has profoundly shaped the planet and its biodiversity. In this remarkable symphony of essays, adapted and expanded from his groundbreaking, critically acclaimed podcast, John Green reviews different facets of the human-centered planet, ranging from the QWERTY keyboard and Halley's Comet to penguins of Madagascar on a 5-star scale. When Jennifer Doudna was in 6th grade, she came home one day to find her dad had left a book, The Double Helix, on her bed. She thought it was one of those detective stories she loved. When she read it, she discovered she was right in a way. She became enthralled by the intense drama behind the competition to discover the code of life. Even though her high school counselor told her girls who didn't become scientists, she decided she would. Driven by a passion to understand how nature works and to turn discoveries into inventions, she and her collaborators would turn a curiosity of nature into an invention that would transform the human race, an easy-to-use tool that can edit DNA. Of course, Walter Isaacson is the author of all kinds of great biographies like Steve Jobs, Leonardo da Vinci, and others. Crying in H Mart. A raw and honest memoir from musician Michelle Zauner. From her experiences growing up in Eugene, Oregon, as one of the only Korean American kids, to caring for her mother through a terminal illness, she takes an unblinking look at some very difficult topics. Empire of Pain, a grand, devastating portrait of 3 generations of the Sackler family, famed for their philanthropy, whose fortune was built by Valium and whose reputation was destroyed by OxyContin. Finding the Mother Tree. In her first book, Simard brings us into her world, the intimate world of the trees, in which she brilliantly illuminates the fascinating and vital truths that trees are not simply the source of timber or pulp, but are a complex, interdependent circle of life, that forests are social, cooperative creatures, connected through underground networks by which trees communicate their vitality and vulnerabilities with communal lives not that different from our own. Fuzz by Mary Roach. Now, Mary Roach is the author of a number of books that are they're called micro-histories, maybe. They deal with different, very kind of specific subjects. So some of her other books included Stiff, The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers, Gulp, Adventures on the Alimentary Canal, and Grunt, The Curious Science of Humans at War. Well, here in Fuzz, she's taking on animal criminals. As the subtitle says, when nature breaks the law. What's to be done about a jaywalking moose? A bear caught breaking and entering? A murderous tree? 300 years ago, animals that broke the law would be assigned legal representation and put on trial. And that's very true. These days, as Mary Roach discovers, the answers are best found not in jurisprudence, but in science, the curious science of human-wildlife conflict. And she deals with a lot of issues ranging from elephants in India to black bears who have taken over the streets of Aspen and other cities at night, and coyotes in the suburbs and everything else. It's really a great book. The Glitter in the Green by John Dunn. Traveling the full length of the hummingbird's range from the cusp of the Arctic Circle to near Antarctic islands, acclaimed nature writer John Dunn encounters birders, scientists, and storytellers in his quest to find these beguiling creatures, immersing us in the world of one of the Earth's most charismatic bird families. Helgoland is by Carlo Rovelli, one of the world's most renowned theoretical physicists. He has entranced millions of readers with his singular perspective on the cosmos. In Helgoland, he examines the enduring enigma of quantum theory. The quantum world Rovelli describes is as beautiful as it is unnerving. The 1921 Tulsa race massacre. We saw a lot of that last year, probably in June when Juneteenth celebrations were going on. There was a lot of talk about this massacre. On the evening of May 31st, 1921, and in the early morning hours of June 1st, several thousand white citizens and authorities violently attacked the African-American Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. In the course of some 12 hours of mob violence, white Tulsans reduced one of the nation's most prosperous Black communities to rubble and killed an estimated 300 people, mostly African Americans. This richly illustrated volume, featuring more than 175 photographs along with oral testimonies, shines a new spotlight on the race massacre from the vantage points of its victims and survivors. A riveting family drama evocative of Angela's ashes in the glass castle about a woman who discovers the shocking secret of the center of her mother's life. Justine had always been told that her mother came from royal blood. The proof could be found in her mother's elegance, her upper crust accent, and a cryptic letter hinting at her claim to a country estate. But beneath the polished veneer lay a fearsome, unpredictable temper that drove Justine from home the moment she was old enough to escape. Years later, her mother sent her an envelope filled with secrets from the past. After her mother's death and overcome with grief, Justine found herself drawn back to that envelope. Its contents revealed a mystery that stretched back to the early days of World War II and beyond, and into the dark corridors of the hospital for the maintenance and education of exposed and deserted young children. This was a great memoir about the author's difficult relationship with her mother, and then discovering probably why that is when she discovered her mother's past life. If you enjoy books about dysfunctional families like I do, you probably would enjoy The Secret Life of Dorothy Solms. A Shape in the Dark by Bjorn. This gentleman lives up in the Alaska Panhandle, and he has a lot of experience with brown bears. His family lived in a cabin as he was growing up. He's been a hunter, a photographer, a guide, leads guide trips. So he has a lot of experience with the brown bears of Admiralty Island and the other islands up there in Alaska. In A Shape in the Dark, wilderness guide and lifelong Alaskan Bjorn weaves personal experience with historical and contemporary accounts to explore the world of brown bears, from encounters with the Lewis and Clark expedition, frightening attacks, including the famed death of Timothy Treadwell, the controversies related to bear hunting, the animal's place in native cultures, and the impacts on the species from habit degradation and climate change. There was a couple of interesting kind of fun facts that came out of this book for me. Admiralty Island in Alaska has the densest population of brown bears on Earth. There's like several brown bears per mile. It's just incredible. You cannot walk across the island without encountering brown bears. The other thing that was really interesting is the maternal DNA of brown bears on the Alaska Peninsula indicates that their female ancestors were actually polar bears. And that's not true of mainland grizzly bears. It's only the bears there on the Panhandle. So they theorize it had something to do with the glaciers and polar bears on the glaciers that were able to get to those Alaskan islands and mated with the brown bears that were there. So they have polar bear DNA, very different. A Swim in a Pond in the Rain by George Saunders. For the last 20 years, George Saunders has been teaching a class on the Russian short story to his MFA students at Syracuse University. Here, he shares a version of that class with us, offering some of what he and his students have discovered together over the years, paired with iconic short stories by Chekhov, Turgenev, Tolstoy, and Gogol. The 7 essays in this book are intended for anyone interested in how fiction works and why it's more relevant than ever in these turbulent times. Many of you know the actor Stanley Tucci. Well, he writes this book, Taste, My Life Through Food. Before he became a household name with The Devil Wears Prada, The Hunger Games, and other movies, he grew up in an Italian-American family that spent every night around the table. He shared the magic of those meals with us in the Tucci cookbook and the Tucci table, and now he takes us beyond the recipes and into the stories behind them. This has been a very popular book. I think it's been checked out ever since we got it. Travels with George by Nathaniel Philbrick. Philbrick has written a lot of American historical nonfiction. This is his latest. Does George Washington Still Matter? Best-selling author Nathaniel Philbrick argues for Washington's unique contribution to the forging of America by retracing his journey as a new president through all 13 former colonies, which were now an unsure nation. Travels with George marks a new first-person voice for Philbrick, weaving history and personal reflection into a single narrative. The Unanswered Letter by Ferris Cassell is another great book. This one isn't a dysfunctional family. This one is sadly a Holocaust story. Ferris Cassell lives in Eugene, and her husband is a physician or surgeon in Eugene. And one day, one of his patients gave him a letter that had been passed down in their family. And I can't exactly remember why. I don't know if it's because the doctor's Jewish or not, but they'd gotten this letter back like 1939, 1940 from somebody in Europe asking for help to get out of Austria. And he gave it to his wife, who's a writer, and she investigated this. In 1939, as the Nazis closed in, Alfred Berger mailed a desperate letter to an American stranger who happened to share his last name. He and his wife, Viennese Jews, had found escape routes for their daughters, but now their money, connections, and emotional energy were nearly exhausted. Alfred begged the American recipient of the letter, "You are surely informed about the situation of all Jews in Central Europe. By pure chance, I got your address. My daughter and her husband will go to America. Help us to follow our children. It is our last and only hope." After languishing in a California attic for decades, Alfred's letter ended up in the hands of Ferris Cassell, a journalist who couldn't rest until she discovered the ending of the story. Traveling across the United States, as well as to Austria, the Czech Republic, Belarus, and Israel, she uncovered an extraordinary story of heart-wrenching loss and unforgettable love that endures to this day. Did the Bergers' desperate letter find a response? Did they and their daughters survive? Did they leave living descendants? You need to read this book to find out. And, it'd be really nice once COVID is away or done or something to have Ferris Cassell come over to our library and do a program about this book. It would be I think it would be a really good program if we could arrange that. Okay, our last nonfiction book, and we're doing really well on time, is Women in White Coats by Olivia Campbell. This is a nonfiction debut for the author. So for fans of Hidden Figures and Radium Girls comes the remarkable story of 3 Victorian women who broke down barriers in the medical field to become the first women doctors, revolutionizing the way women receive healthcare. That is the final nonfiction book. So Erin, do we have questions?
Nobody posted one in the chat. Is there anything anyone would like to ask about?
Oh, there's last slide. Well, we do have the book lists on the shelves by the reference section. Erin's also going to post the discussion list online. A little booklet we don't really post online. It doesn't print well that way. But that's going to be online, and eventually the video is going to be online too. I think Erin has to do some editing and stuff and to put it together. So it's probably going to be next week for the video. But if you run into people who want to see it, check next week on YouTube. Okay.
Kevin, thank you so much.
Certainly. Glad you could make it.
Thank you. Thank you. This was really good.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
It's a little
thank you
weird
so
doing it in my office.
Okay. Thanks again.
Okay,
Bye.
thanks.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Thank you.